Hi, I'm William Cook, and this is my final video presentation for the American Revolution class here at Liberty University. And the subject is presenting our findings from our final research project, the subject we've been researching the entire time. And my research started based off of one quote that I kind of fell in love with at the beginning of class. It was resistance to tyranny is obedience to God. Now, that was absolutely said by Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson at one point or another. My studies kind of couldn't determine who said it first, but it was absolutely presented by Benjamin Franklin in a certain pamphlet that was advertising it was pro-revolution and resistance to Great Britain, and Thomas Jefferson used it as well, and it was presented to be part of the original American seal, which also contained images from the story of Moses leading his people out of Egypt. Now, all of this, going into this subject, it was subject to change at all times. And it was chapter 6 on our books, God of Liberty, that really kind of made me zero in on a certain subject, and that was the ministers and chaplains inside the American Revolution. The Christian aspect took on a whole new focus when my research kind of led me to characters or leaders such as Peter Muhlenberg and George Washington, who is actually hand in hand involved with Peter Muhlenberg. One quote from our book here by Thomas S. Kidd, they were talking about George Washington and how the chaplains being assigned to the units was important. It said, patriots like General George Washington, the chaplain's work was absolutely essential for sustaining the enormous sacrifices required of the soldiers and for assuring the army that God was on their side. Now, the Continental Army actually assigned chaplains to military units. In George Washington's General Orders, I believe 23, he actually assigned his soldiers to attend the Sunday services. Now, the chaplains were there for more than that. They were there for prayer, kind of teach soldiers about God, kind of keep their morale high. And I mentioned Peter Muhlenberg. This was absolutely, without question, the favorite part of my research. He was we've all seen that movie, The Patriot, with Mel Gibson, and there was a pastor that took up arms and joined his unit. Well, that was based off of a real character by the name of Peter Muhlenberg. And he was a pastor for the Lutheran Church, and he gave a famous sermon in Virginia. And this sermon, it has no direct documents. It was the story was documented by his grandson in a biography he wrote about him years later. And also there's evidence to it in a journal entry from a soldier by the name of Thatcher who served in his unit. He gave a sermon saying that there's a time for prayer and a time for war, and that time for war has come. And at that point, he disrobed his pastor gown and stood there in his military attire. Now, that was inspirational to a lot because 300 soldiers actually signed up that day. That's where my research took a turn. I started thinking about the influence that Christianity had on the soldiers and the positive impact that it had, and whether or not it was a difference maker in the war. And I absolutely think it was, because Peter Muhlenberg was actually assigned his own unit. He got out as a brigadier general, but at the time he was in charge of the Virginia's 8th Regiment that was out of Virginia, obviously. And that's where 300 people that day signed up to serve directly under him. George Washington also took notice of him. There was times in some more general orders, I actually found a bunch of general orders by George Washington, just how he directly commanded his men, and he loved the discipline and the morale of Peter Muhlenberg's military. And I don't think that was by accident. I think that was by Peter Muhlenberg's influence and his leadership as a pastor, and showing these men the way of God and the discipline. And he actually sent them to march to Philadelphia in order to set a good impression of the Continental Army. Peter Muhlenberg was actually there for the Battle of Germantown, and more importantly, the Siege of Yorktown, which is understood to be the war that, or battle that ended the American Revolution as America became victorious. So Peter Muhlenberg, a pastor at one point and now a primary leader in the American Revolution, had a significant impact on the entire outcome of the war. So my research kind of parallels him with the American Revolution, because you could follow both the timeline of the war and the career of Peter Muhlenberg, and it could tell you the story, or at least a outline of the story of the American Revolution.